Hello, I'm Mary Lou Willits from the Middletown Springs Historical Society. Today we're talking with David Wright, Society President, about the influence of A.W. Gray and Sons Company on the history of Middletown Springs. David, tell us, how did A.W. Gray really influence the history of Middletown Springs?
Well, the A.W. Gray Company from the mid-1850s played an enormous role right up through the rest of the century till the early 1900s. Well, A.W. Gray started his business in about 1845 in a shed behind his house. And he had his eldest son, Leonidas, as a helper. He had not yet obtained a patent on his improvements of the horsepower treadmill, and we don't know what treadmill he was working with to try to improve it, but he had some definite changes that he received patents for. The horsepower treadmill was set up on a stand on the front that slightly elevated the front of the treadmill. The horse was brought onto it and basically walked in place, turning the treadmill and transferring the horsepower into mechanical power that was then used to power other equipment. So as the business grew and he was ready to go into production, he purchased a building along the Polteny River just up the street from where he was living, on the north side of the river, near where the river crosses South Street. And it was a brick building that had been a fulling mill. And fulling has to do with the cleaning raw wool in the spinning of the yarn and the weaving of the cloth. The water power was used in the factory and apparently had been used in the fulling mill.
When I look at the Polteny River today, I just can't believe that, how could it have powered a factory year-round? How did that work?
Well, it was rather ingenious. They figured out a way to divert water from the river to mill ponds and store it until needed and release it gradually to offer continuous power. The water was taken out of the river to the east, upstream from where the Mineral Springs Park now is. And it was diverted to create a pond. It was diverted from the Polteny River to another series of ponds. It was then transported to the mill site on South Street. The difference in elevation between the Polteny River and the fulling factory building was what gave the water the power to turn the water wheel or turbine at the factory. The water could be collected in these series of holding ponds and then released at the time that they wanted to run the machinery. Each machine that was set up on the factory floor was connected to an overhead shaft which had pulleys on it, and it was connected by leather belts. You could turn each machine on and off by adjusting that leather belt. At some point, they purchased a steam engine that provided the same sort of power, but more reliably. Similarly, when the treadmills that were produced in the factory and the threshers that were built there and the various kinds of saws and silo loaders and other machinery that was manufactured there, they were connected by leather belts. The treadmill could power your thresher by connecting the two with a leather belt, putting the horse on the treadmill, and then working on the machine. Well, we have on display here in the museum a dog power or sheep power treadmill. And that was used for small tasks like churning butter, and also for possibly powering a washing machine, a primitive washing machine. That small treadmill could be attached to whatever equipment you wanted to run by means of a leather belt. The horsepower factory at its peak, which would have probably been in the 1880s and maybe into the 1890s, employed about 60 men and boys. They also established the Gray Bank, which was in the same building. So there were offices and a bank facility in the building, as well as a factory floor on 2 different levels that were producing the equipment. Behind the building, there were enormous piles of lumber that had been cut at sawmills around town and delivered and was drying and seasoning in the back, ready to be used. It's said that one of the problems toward the end was they were having a hard time finding the lumber because the local mills had pretty much exhausted the available lumber supply in the area, and they had to go farther afield and pay more money for the materials that went into the construction of the treadmills.
Was Gray's Market primarily local?
Not at all. It was sold all over the country at the time and shipped by rail and by water, even to South America, Mexico, to Europe. And in fact, there's a record of horsepower equipment being sold in Russia. It was well known, but it was one of many similar products made essentially out of wood and with metal fittings, which was supplanted later by steel and iron machinery that was lighter in weight, more durable, stronger, and probably cheaper to produce. One of the issues with the production from the Gray factory in Middletown Springs was that there was no rail service to Middletown Springs. The equipment was hauled on horse-drawn wagons to the railhead in Poultney from Middletown Springs. The road between Middletown Springs and Poultney was always a problem in terms of maintenance, and the Grays actually contributed to the construction of one bypass of the road to a new location out on the west end of town. In fact, it was going into Poultney that the road was relocated down along the Poultney River, whereas previously it had gone over a hill and down, connecting at what's now Morse Hollow Road. The road was relocated between what is now Parker Water Wells and where there's a fork in the road that goes off to the north and then comes out over on Morse Hollow Road, a matter of probably a mile at the most. Around the turn of the 20th century, the A.W. Gray and Sons, now 2 sons, was looking to modernize and to go into a different line. They purchased the Ruggles Foundry in Poultney, where they had some of the castings that they used in the construction of the horsepower treadmills and threshers and other things. They had been in business with Ruggles for parts for those things. Ruggles Foundry became available for sale, and the Grays purchased the Ruggles Foundry. They purchased it, and it became the Gray Foundry. One of the products that the Ruggles had developed was a line of gasoline engines, small portable engines that could be used on the farm to power equipment that previously had been powered by horsepower treadmills. So the Grays then began to market these engines, and some people say they were the same engines that the Ruggles had been making with just a different name plaque on them. And they were able to put them in their catalogs and market them in the early 1900s. And that Gray foundry went on to producing things like truck beds that could be added to the back of a Model T Ford chassis and cab. So it became a pickup truck using a Gray product as the bed of at the rear of the truck. Equipment that the treadmills powered that were produced in the factory in Middletown Springs now were marketed to small farmers and also small entrepreneurs who might take a treadmill and a thresher around from farm to farm to deal with the harvest from individual farmers. They were all basically made out of wood, and one of the changes in the industry was to make them out of steel, kind of the way truck bodies and tractors were made. And there were big companies in the Midwest like Case and John Deere and others that were producing these on an industrial scale, just like the automobile was being produced now in big factories rather than in small shops as they were originally created. So the Grays couldn't keep up with that. Though the factory closed in probably 1915 to 1918 was the time when it was officially declared bankrupt and a receivership established, someone else to run the remnant of the building and to try to make some use of the facilities and equipment as possible, sell off some of the assets that were no longer being used. For instance, I think the foundry in Poultney became a separate entity. If it wasn't already a separate entity, it was disconnected from the business in Middletown Springs. The receiver was a man named Steinholtz from Granville, New York, who established some other businesses in there. He bought equipment to make wooden clothespins, and the clothespins were produced under the same name as the horsepower treadmill had been, or the threshers. They were called Gray Line, which was one of the trade names of the product toward the end, the Gray Line thresher. That devolved into the Gray Line clothespin. And then later on, there was a toy factory in the building. They produced children's toys made out of wood, and local people were employed to put together these toys and paint them and get them ready for marketing. So that went on into the 1930s, and the building finally was demolished in 1938.